Hi, thank you for attending my webinar here on, excuse me, on CE mark required to sell medical devices in the EU. It's very similar to what the FDA is doing in the United States. So just to start off to give, kind of an overview, very similar to the regulatory process. The FDA extends into HIPAA, whereas with the EU, the compliance is more or less a reporting back and forth, and it involves multiple parties at times. So it's a bit different. The agenda for this webinar will begin with the understanding of what the regulatory system is throughout the EU. It varies between each individual state to some degree. The national body can have different, more stringent criteria regarding more specific types of medical devices, things that are more invasive, for example. And cases throughout the EU reflect that. Various issues that have had problems within the past regarding manufacturers selling these devices. So that'll be addressed a little more in depth. The CE mark, why is it used for selling medical devices? What exactly does it mean? Because, you could sell without it, but, the regulatory environment regarding the CE mark certainly indicates that the liability is far less, meaning that you've met the regulatory requirements of the EU. The assessment procedures that lead to medical device directives. So how are these devices assessed? How does the EU go about, specifically the Commission, how do they go about providing the assessment criteria that lead to these directives? And obtaining, the CE mark for your device, what exactly would you have to do? The classification criteria based on what you're trying to sell within the EU as a medical device. Appointing a European authorized representative to enable compliance processes, so that if you are outside of the EU, or if you have started a company that is non-domestic and to do business with the EU outside of the Union, you would have an authorized rep to handle the logistics of the regulatory process. Wherever the business is being held, with the national body, at the national body level, generally speaking, if it's not a very risky type of device. The registration process to facilitate device medical compliance. So again, with the classification, what would you have to do to register the device? The classification is based on the level of risk primarily, and therefore data, different levels of data would have to be obtained to identify the level of risk and safety regarding the device. And that can vary based on where the national body is. If it's from France, it might be a little more stringent compared to another EU state. Centralized authority, just really quickly, they're looking to move toward having a centralized authority where it's not so much the national body, whereas the oversight is primarily the EU, the Commission, and the joint staffs that they would have doing the assessments at the national body would be more or less not too much of an oversight, but they will be there for the reporting requirement, and that's part of the regulatory framework for the devices being sold in the EU. Okay. So what exactly is the CE mark? It's a similar type of regulatory framework as I had mentioned before, that is similar to what the FDA has established in the U.S. Specific to device manufacturing and medical app use in the EU, and it ensures the device was inspected and approved. So the CE mark carries with it a level of value. It establishes that the vendor can facilitate transactions in the EU with your device because your device is approved. I'll get into it a little later with France regarding reimbursement where that becomes a little more important. So the device selection regarding reimbursement for services rendered becomes a little more selective on the device and the CE mark. The CE mark, what it does is it provides protections to the end user by linking the manufacturer to the supplier. So, essentially the vendor, which would be if you're outside of the U.S. Oh, I'm sorry, if you're in the U.S. and outside of the EU, and you're doing business in the EU, the vendor would essentially be the liaison, the appointee per se, to designate and facilitate the business within the EU. So that would be part of the protections that I'll also get into a little later with the auditing process regarding the post-release surveillance of the quality and integrity of the product that was released, the medical device that was released. So we get to the enabling of the auditing process of the manufacturer and the main subcontractors. And just about, I would imagine, every medical manufacturing company has something downstream. So this gets to be fairly important. That would be a main subcontractor, even if it's one company doing whether it's the programming of the software or whatever it may be. It would be a key component of the manufacturing process, and they will have to undergo the auditing process as well. And if it's using clinical data, if it's a medical app, is either using clinical data that is new, or it's using benchmark data, something very similar to it. It'll be the same thing. It has to go through the same type of auditing process, and at the subcontractor level as well. So this is getting a little more stringent because of the problems that have happened in the past with failures of the manufacturing process and the implications that lead to patient issues, safety issues, which is really something that they want to get at now, because you have so many manufacturers starting to get into the market because they see a lot of dollars in it, or euros, or whatever it may be, and they want to get into that. And if the regulatory compliance is not in place, which they're finding out, the auditing is particularly what they're looking at. If that's not in place, simply there's mistakes that come up, and none of that is reinforced because the data hasn't been looked at, because it hasn't been asked for. So it's getting fairly complicated to the degree where, manufacturers have to employ scientists or third-party scientists to clean the data, look at the data, and make sure that what they're presenting is very accurate. So that's part of the question of whether or not there is sufficient compliance staff in place to maintain the device compliance. And that's part of the underlying regulatory process of the data collection of what the device is supposed to do. And that gets into what I'll get into a little later about performance and safety. So the device is expected to perform a certain way. And some of these devices are now very invasive. These are hard, pacemakers and so on. So the compliance is very important with the underlying safety of how the software functions, and quality testing, whether or not the software can be accessed without authorization, these sorts of things that necessarily the EU is not going to test every single manufacturer on, but the idea is this is the type of information that you want to supply. If it's benchmarking and the benchmarking data is not there, that would be something that could be added to it. So you're addressing these areas of risk that would lead to getting the quality mark, the CE mark. It also ensures the manufacturer identifies a commitment to internal policies that ensure medical device responsibility with software development. And the internal policies will generally reflect the organization, not necessarily the hierarchy, but the access to the personnel that would require for the data to be presentable and to have value, to show that